Let me just put my presentation. Okay, so good night, everyone. I'm going to do presentation as some of you have already heard me speak a lot about Sérgio Ferro. So I think I'm trying to start a new I think it's a new moment in my research projects that are more explicitly aligned with STP's problems and research project in general. So what I'm going to be presenting here is it's still a work in progress because I've just started becoming acquainted with his work, but I think it's something that will interest the group, and I think something that might be good for the English speakers is that there is currently a project for people who are interested in Ferro. There is currently a project that is translating his work into English. I don't think there's many articles that have been translated, but this will be something that will be happening sometime in the future.
This is a project of yours, or is it an ongoing project?
No, unfortunately, it's not mine. It's a project called.
Just clarify.
Yeah, it's called Translating Ferro, Transforming Knowledges. There was even scholarships involved, but I didn't know Ferro at the time, so it's a pity. But it's mostly done by people in architecture, so I think they have a different approach from what I'm trying to do here. But like I said, this is the first part of a project, and this is Ferro. And just to give some background, Ferro is an architect and painter. He's one of the organizers of a movement that was called the New Architecture Movement, or I mean, Arquitetura Nova. And they were famous for doing houses that had these curvy roofs and walls, because the main insight of this was that when you are doing a house, you have to consider the not only the project, the idea, the final product, but you also have to consider the prospect of that this is going to be built by someone, and this means that probably this is going to take some time, and that there are more efficient and less efficient ways of building things. And I don't know, I think Ferro actually has a study on the history of building sites in Europe, but in Brazil, building sites are generally made by poor people or people who don't have political power. So there's a kind of submission of the drawing. The drawing submits the work, and it doesn't care for the safety, for the condition of the worker. So when you do the house with this kind of roof, for example, it's an easy structure to build in engineering terms. And it allows, for example, not only for the workers to not have to worry about having to do edges and stuff, but they also provide a cover for the people who are going to work the house, who are going to build it. And they will, in a sense, have a better time when trying to decide the other steps of the project, like what is going where, how is it going to be divided, shared, etc. So this movement, which is the new architecture, it is a criticism of basically two different points in Brazilian architecture, in the history of Brazilian architecture. The first is a criticism of Brasilia. I don't know if many of you know this, but Brasilia, not only was it built in like in couple, I mean, I don't know how many years, but it was not many years, but it was like basically hell for people who worked there. Many people went there for jobs because of lack of resources. The construction conditions were terrible. A lot of people died, either due in the building sites or due to trying to organize for better working conditions. So there's this contradiction that Brasilia was, in thesis, organized, thought out by socialist and communist architects. Some of them were actually in the Brazilian Communist Party. But as always, it sounds obvious after someone points it out, but it's like the communists, they were not aware that the people who were building the communist utopia, they would literally die without ever having to see it, or even like, you know, they didn't have a place for them in the city also, because the workers had to go to the satellite cities of Brasilia. So Brasilia it's horrible. Yeah, I've never lived there, but I had an aunt who lived there, and it's like I can't even call it a city in a sense. It's just weird, and it's a terrible place. But besides that, there's also a criticism not only of the construction of Brasilia, but also of those modernist architects that built Brasilia and also other modernist buildings. Because like they were all, this is like, apparently this was something big. There were a lot of modernist architects that were in the Communist Party. And yeah, I think it's a lot of Platonov vibes. And those architects, they were very influenced by things such as Bauhaus, where they were trying to reshape the modern life of the bourgeois society, but discounting the fact that there was no bourgeois society in Brazil, as there are in core parts of the world, in the global north. There's the fact that, well, you're going to build structures that are going to not incorporate the problem of the building itself. And in the end, modernist Brazilian architecture, it's made for rich people who have money to buy fancy houses that, if they are, it's like the earlier version of wokeness in Brazilian architectural history. And so Sérgio Ferro, he was an architect who tried to go against that, but due to the Brazilian dictatorship, he joined the, how do you say, luta armada. He took up guns. He exploded banks. He was like in the party of Carlos Marighella, which was an armed struggle. He was in the party of Carlos Marighella, which was a dissident from the Communist Party, and he was arrested. He was tortured. He got to meet many workers who worked in Brasilia and who were like suffered the building, and this really reframed his way of thinking about architecture. Oh, and just a gossip, because I mean, who doesn't love a gossip? He talks about this in a very, he's very ashamed, so I can approve that. But he tells that he knew of Brasilia because he was an undergrad in architecture school. He was like in the second and third year, but his father, he was a politician for PSD, which is like, I don't know, it's like a right-wing party in Brazil. And he was also an incorporator. I mean, he was into real estate. So he got a lot of orders that he projected buildings in Brasilia while he was an undergrad because his father had lots of connections. So in a sense, he was a spoiled brat, but at least I think he made up for it. So we can forgive him and we can embrace him in the communist struggle. It's very funny because he's very ashamed when he talks about that. But as I was saying, he was arrested because he was in the armed struggle. And then he left Brazil to teach architecture in Grenoble in France. And that's what he's been doing since the 70s. He's been living in France. I don't know why he didn't come back. And he developed an enormous research project that is at the same time a history of architecture and a history of plastic arts. I was looking for this. I didn't know if this term existed in English. The Wikipedia page was so small. I don't know, because plastic arts is like to involve all the like sculpture or painting, not just painting. But so Sérgio Ferro, he has a double-sided project, which is architecture and free work and plastic arts and free work. Because in a sense, he sees them as a real political experimentation towards freedom, each in their own way with their own limitations. I'm actually, like I said, this is a work in progress. I hope to present in the future things on his architectural thought and experiments. And since he is alive and he seems to be very open to talking to random groups, as people can see in his YouTube pages, I'm hoping to invite him to, if he would be available to talk with us about our project and our ideas. It would have to be done in Portuguese, but I think this would be very good for our, I mean, I think it would be interesting because he seems like a very generous and nice person. But like I said, Ferro, he has a double-sided project, which on one hand tries to understand architecture as a side of potential collective struggle and liberation, because we are dealing with matters of social reproduction at its core. I mean, the establishment of places to live and to live together. It makes architecture as and it's also a type of activity which involves manual labor and intellectual labor. So he will see it as a privileged place of political action. And he will also find in his studies of architecture that the history of architecture, it gets a new light when we think of it through the point of view of capitalist development. Because as he tries to point out in numerous places, the history of architecture, we had like in the beginning, medieval architecture, at least, where it's a starting point before capitalism, they were organized with you had like people who knew how to like build rock structures, wood structures, and then they would have like a general outline, but they would work out the solutions together to the problems, and the building was in a sense a collective creation. When you start developing cities, the city estates in the Italian and Mediterranean region, larger projects start happening, and projects that in a sense require more organization, because they are going to be building sites that will last for decades. I mean, he takes, for example, some I think the main church in Florence, which is I think the Duomo. I don't know if you've guys seen it. It's really bizarre and huge. Renzo can probably take a picture of it for us. But the thing that was happening at that time is there was the beginning of the establishment of capitalist production, relations of production in a capitalist sense, and what they did when they were trying to organize these great works of architecture was they called people who had experience in organizing production through in the manufactural way, and then they started submitting the workers in construction to a logic that was outside the construction site. So in a sense, he will say that the history of architecture will be a history that will hide the manual labor through the submission of the construction to the orders of the architectural drawing and of the architect. And this is in a sense, a fetishization because, and this is the problem, the drawing is never enough for architecture because there are many solutions that cannot be mapped out because they depend on certain knowledges that have not been fully, that are not free from some local knowledge that is restricted in certain groups. So in a sense, the architecture side of this project will present the possibilities for a collective liberation once we can deconstruct the separation between drawing and the construction site. But there's also another side of his project, which I've gotten more acquainted, which tries to understand the plastic arts as a place where there is developed a work that is free from the laws of the capitalist market. And in a sense, he will do that, the artist will do that through a determinate negation of the artisan labor in the early developments of capitalism. So what we have is a certain kind of laborer, which is the image producer, that he will do to certain strategies. He will uncouple himself from the capitalist, from the laws of the capitalist market, which oppress and subordinate all kinds of labor in the social order. So in a sense, the plastic arts, they are a site of experimentation of what free work can be. Now, of course, this work is not, this free work is not completely free. I mean, we all know that, I mean, at least that's where I got it from, like art history in school. There was these patrons, they were generally aristocrats and the church. And of course, they exert some power on the artists. They limit what they do. But when he says that plastic arts free themselves from the law of the capitalist market, it's because they produce a work that doesn't, it has a price without value. So in that sense, it will be an exception from the capitalist market. And this is not done, through like, oh, look at us, we built this magical object which is different from everything. No, he will try to read art history as some sort of a series of strategies of determinate negation. He's a very weird mix of references. He's like a Peircean and Hegelian Marxist who loves Capital Book 3 because he's an architect. So I mean, the problems of land are something that matter for him, but he will also put in Lacan, Heidegger, whatever. I mean, it's very healthy, I think, because he really doesn't seem to care what he's citing as long as it's useful. So I really do think he would very much enjoy our group vibe here. But, and he does this, and this is because this is a very weird book. He will read the art history by looking at it is he will read art history as a movement away from the labor done in craft corporations. So these works are not analyzed like we generally see in critical theory as a finished wholes that express emphasis, that express formal emphasis or limits in social relations. He's not Frederick Jameson. He's not like mapping the totality of social relations through what is represented in Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. He's not doing that. He's looking at the works as traces of a certain type of organization. So in a sense, what he says is that even if arts are like generally ascribed to singular artists, what we see when we look at the production is that they are also mirroring, in some sense, the craft corporations, where you have like someone who is the boss, who designs, who gives out the idea, but there are also tons of people involved who can also substitute the head of the head of the corporation. And yes, this point about the price, this is a pity. Just so you can know, this project, Plastic Arts and Free Work, it was supposed to be a 3-volume book, but he said that he's very old. I mean, he's like 80. So he's going to finish with book 2, where he would try and understand the transformations of capitalist society through the transformation of the labor involved in art. So he did a volume 1, which is from Durer to Velazquez. Then he did a volume 2, which is basically a book on Manet. He really loves Manet. I think he wanted to do his Manet book. And then he ends it saying that analytical cubism Picasso phase is the high point of modern art. And then he says that there would be a volume 3 that would work with, I think, pop art performances, but he says that he's too old for that. So, I mean, it's a pity. But I think that's where the separation of price and value would, I think, appear more clearly. So it's I'm working through the 2nd volume right now, and I do think it shines a lot of light, but I think there's, well, in the coming months, I will probably come back to this. So what is basically this was like a sort of long introduction. What is the dilemma of the plastic artist that makes him try and be what he is these days? Well, this is something that he says, actually he says this in volume 2, but it's a weirdly lazy book, but it's very rigorous. I can't really explain it except mentioning the term sprezzatura, which he uses to describe one of the strategies of Renaissance art. But he says that there was this guild of image producers, which was actually the same guild of pharmacists. I think that probably has to do with the fact that they were dealing with chemicals, or I mean paint, and I don't know. I think it's probably that. But they were image producers that were organized as laborers through corporations. These corporations were places where the passing down of knowledge was done orally, so they could at least have some sort of political power in how they were going to deal with demands and with other social actors. But with the early development of capitalist modes of relation, these guilds would become increasingly oppressed by the spread of the law of value. Ferro doesn't get into it much because I don't think he's trying to develop this point in a Marxological way. But what he's basically saying is that the production starts to be oriented toward the market, and this in turn tends to make the production need to be speedier, more organized, so they can present something that is, in a sense, reproducible, so that it doesn't have the traces of artisanal labor. So this would make labor harder. This would make life a bit. It would make life more oppressive. So the artist, in a sense, he can be seen as some sort of figure that is trying to get away from this form of exploitation. So the spread of the law of value, there was an increase in craft corporations' internal corruption. I mean, he talks about the fact that merit was not being used as a ruler for deciding who would go up and down the ladder, who would become a master. And also there's the fact that manual labor is in a sense socially unworthy. When when you have the structures where you have the aristocrats and the church where they don't mix with their hands. If your line of work, if you're a poet, all you're doing is speaking, you're close to the spirit. But if you're dealing with painting, if you're building buildings, you have to work with your hands in a sense. And that is a sign of your social position in society. So the question that he takes is, how do you free yourself from this kind of oppression while being involved in an activity that cannot not be manual? I mean, because if you are a poet, you don't have to, you have you don't have to deal with manual activity. And in fact, if we take the technology of writing, at least from what I've read and studied, most people, until very recently, they did not even write their own works. I mean, they either dictated them to slaves or they dictated them to their wives. I mean, even someone as late as Henry James, he dictated it to his secretary because he was rich, and Dostoevsky dictated it to his wife. I mean, his wife was his secretary and he married her. I mean, I think he was trying to cut costs probably. I mean, to kill two birds with one stone. That's very nice of him. So that's the problem. And yeah, he likes to use these weird words. You might. Yeah, Lorenzo, he tries to explain them in volume 2. He has a chapter which is called Fatura and Feitura, and it's really interesting. But so before we start, we have to see what is craft labor. Né? What is the standard of labor in the Middle Ages? But feitura is basically the manner of producing, and fatura is the produced object in this manner. But what are he will single out some properties of craft labor. Basically, they are manual labor, which indicates the inferior social position compared to liberal arts. They are works that are produced through a certain technique. So, I mean, all the poiesis, the Aristotle poiesis stuff. Production, even if it's not capitalist relation mode of production, it's highly organized and codified. And the secrets are kept inside the corporation, so it gives them an upper hand in struggle in negotiating with governments and with clients. And also, it's a work that it shows traces of production, but it does not leave traces of individual producers. This is very important. For example, this image here is an engraving in wood. And in a sense, I mean, it looks like any generic image that would produce by, I mean, a person. I mean, this could be done by anyone. There are no traces that indicate a specific author or artist. So, and why is this important? Because any kind of trace would, in a sense, indicate a deformation or an error that would take away attention from the final product, and that would decrease its value on the market. So there was an attempt. This can be, in a sense, I think, a pre-manufactured mode of production, in the sense that it is concerned with the market, but it's not organized in this. So the markets are not socially organized in a sense completely. Well, the demands will start to increase, and we will see plastic arts as a negative determination of craft labor. This is, I think, where Ferro, his Hegelian self, is interesting, because you cannot simply invent a new mode of being, of working out of thin air. So he will say that the way towards freedom is when we negate unfreedom. And the Renaissance arts will develop three strategies. Of course, they are schematized. They are, of course, more mixed in practice, and he details this in the book. But there are three strategies that move the artist away from craft labor: virtuosity, smoothness, or the window, which is, I think the window is something that is in the painting treatise by Alberti. I get mixed up in the names. And then there is the strategy of the non finito sprezzatura. So there's only one question I think that's important to note, because you can ask yourself, okay, but why the hell would these people escape, go away from why would they want to leave? How would this be done? How would they gain the position that they actually gained? And he outlines two possible reasons. He doesn't choose between them, but he's a bit cynical, so he thinks it's the second one. He says that, well, you could see the struggle of artists as an ethical battle. I mean, they are people who are suffering from oppression, from the increasing demands on labor, so they try to struggle out of these heavy demands. This would be like if the artists, they achieved through their own greatness, through their own virtuosity, they escaped the law of capitalist value. He isn't very convinced by that. He tends to favor the explanation that the artists, they are the effect of a new social class that is establishing, that needs a new symbolic distinction. So it will rarefy certain products, which will make them more, they will create a scarcity, an artificial scarcity through certain criteria that will stimulate image producers to try and develop their work in this direction, because it promises a better life than being an ordinary laborer in the ordinary market. So how do these determinate negations work? Well, the first one is virtuosity as the restitution of the laborer producer. And the case for this is principally Dürer. I don't know how to pronounce this. So this is like the classic image of Dürer, Melancholia. And if you can see the difference, I mean, if you can compare these different works, they have some similarity. It still seems that Dürer is working in the same type of image, but he's like that person who draws really well, and he wants you to know that he draws really well because he will put infinite traces, like, look at me, I can show all the shades of light only with my pencil. I mean, he's like that kind of person. You know, like when people are, they show off their ability, their higher technical skill. And when they do that, what they are negating is the invisibilization of the producer subject. Like I said, the craft product, it has traces of production, but it does not have traces of the producer. So what he does is like, look, this is me. I am a producer. I am someone who is creating an art object which was done by someone. So, but how does he do that in practice? Well, he does that by avoiding deadlines. I mean, it's simple as that. And this is important because what Ferro is trying to do, I think, is that he's trying to, in a certain sense, not see the artist as a genius, as someone who will have this particular point of view, who will express himself in a certain manner. Not that this isn't important to art. Of course, this is important to art. But if we look at art from the point of view of organization, of reorganization of a mode of work, then what's the difference between Dürer and other engravers is that he will take more time to produce. That's why he can develop a higher technical skill. It's not because he's a genius. It's because he's not respecting deadlines. But this strategy has a problem, as Ferro points out. You are trying to separate yourself from normal workers, but this is only a quantitative difference. You are not doing another thing. You are only doing better work than they are, in a sense. Better in the sense not that it's like qualitatively better, but like since you have more time, you'll get to put more details, more ornaments and stuff. So that's where we have the second strategy. And this is where we usually identify the core of Renaissance, which is the idea that the artist wants to produce a perfect image of reality. It's where the idea of imitatio, mimesis, it's all in there. So the painting, the sculpture is in a certain sense a viewpoint of reality. And part of the idea that it is a viewpoint is that you have to erase the marks, the traces that show that it is produced. So like, I think this is, I don't know if this was in the Mona Lisa, but they X-ray all these paintings, and then you can't, even if you X-ray them, you can't find out the brush strokes that Leonardo did on them. They are made invisible, and they are made invisible through certain techniques, which I think it's called glacis. Ferro is a painter, and he talks about painters. It's very interesting also. He talks about painters with what he calls kitchen talk. Like he isn't interested in what they are doing. He is interested in how they are doing. So he's very knowledgeable on the techniques, and I think that's what makes him appreciate these artists, not as artists, but as workers. So you will develop many techniques that make paintings look as if they are not produced. So in a sense, what you're negating here is the production process, the traces of a general production. So what is erased here is the manual aspect of labor. So here we have a qualitative break, because there are works that have traces of being produced, and then there are works that are simply presented as things that exist. But the problem is, it takes a lot of work. And this is the case for Leonardo. Leonardo finished like 5 paintings in his life. I think this must be the good life. Not having to finish your works. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted to watch, like, I'm sure there are like thousands of YouTube videos explaining and showing it. I'll get to that sometime. But so it's a nice strategy because it creates a break between craft labor and artistic labor, but because the labor is not manual anymore, but it takes a whole lot of labor to do that. And since it takes a whole lot of labor to do that, you're back on the manual labor wagon in a sense. And this will take us to the third strategy, which is the non finito. There's a fourth strategy, which is called the spectator. And spectator, it's basically, there was like a fad in the Renaissance where you had to like pretend that you were all cool and relaxed. Like, nothing, those people that like they emanate the feeling that they are always serene and like chill. That's what painters had to sell. They had to sell the image of being chill. So there are treatises on the social life, the treatise on social life in the Renaissance. They're basically telling people to be chill, and that's the persona that the artists had to incorporate. But there is also a technical strategy in this third strategy, which is the non finito. And as you can see in this sculpture of Michelangelo, it's like an unfinished sculpture. And it's an unfinished sculpture not because he got bored and he didn't know where to go. It's an unfinished sculpture as a concept. If you think about it, it's like a genius invention. I'm going to work less because I'm going to say that the main point of the work is not the material object, but it's the idea. That's basically what they are doing here. The unfinishedness is a sign of something that is beyond that work. This, just so I won't talk about this today, and because I'm not done organizing these ideas, but this is what will be negated in modern painting, especially by Manet. What is negated by Manet and by other impressionists is the idea that there is an idea. There are no ideas. There is only pure production, as opposed to a further stage in capitalist development where there is only abstract work, where you're completely alienated from the production process. But we can leave this for another moment. So the point of the work is not a finished representation, like, you know how you go to, there's this thing I don't know if this exists in other cities, but I love something that exists in Rio, which is, if you go to like residential buildings, there are always pictures of Rio. I mean, it's like you have to represent Rio anywhere you're going. We are in love with this horrible city. Not Caron. Caron is not in love with this horrible city, and I judge him a lot on that. But all of us, the other ones, it's like a need. It's everywhere. So, but we know these images, they are not produced as artistic objects. They have a function. And in a sense, they want to present something. They are a representation. But what happens in Renaissance painting, and Michelangelo is one of the innovators, and that's why he's like, Michelangelo is like the personal hero of Sérgio Ferro. He has his favorites. His favorites are Michelangelo and Caravaggio, of course. I mean, who doesn't love Caravaggio? He was like a playboy in Renaissance Italy. But the thing is, it points to an idea outside of the work of art. So there's a decentering of art. Art is not about ideas. I mean, art is not about materials, an object. It's about ideas, or a conceito. And this is the Aufhebung, because we finally arrive at intellectual labor. Arts are not about hands, they are about mind. And there's also, I mean, what's at stake here is the idea, Leonardo da Vinci's idea that painting is cosa mentale. So, but what are the drawbacks of the non-finito? Even if you have less work than the smooth strategy, you still have to produce this non-finito through technical means. You have to give solutions. I mean, it can't just be something that's left undone. You have to produce the undoneness, the unfinishedness. So the artist maybe won't have to know, I mean, he won't have to work like a workaholic, but he will have to know his art a lot. He will have to know his craft. And when he has to know his craft to produce a concept, he's back on the manual labor wagon. And this is very interesting because I won't talk about this today because the presentation would get too long, but this is especially something that appears in Velazquez's work, because he does presentations of just one. I can give you images later in the chat, but he analyzes Velazquez's painting, especially this one, and he also analyzes Las Meninas. Of course, he says everybody is wrong, and he says everybody is wrong because nobody tried to see how this work is constructed. So he does like drawings, what would the perspective have to be so he can draw what he draws, etc. He says like Foucault is wrong. He says it's a nice explanation, Foucault, but it's wrong because it doesn't make sense in a technical manner. And basically, what the drama of Velazquez's life is that he wanted to be a nobleman. He was a painter, but he needed to be a nobleman. He needed to never have touched on, he never had to work with his hands. So like he became a noble in the year before his death. It was what he wanted all his life, but he had to get numerous testimonies that he never worked with his hands in his life, which is like, what the fuck? You are a fucking painter. Even if you don't do the whole painting, I mean, come on, your hands are dirty in some sense. So it's like you have to paint your way out of manual labor. It's like it's a productive contradiction. So, but there are also another drawback which points to the fact that they are not so free, is that, well, the aesthetic solutions, they are not always pleasurable for the patrons. I mean, you have some solutions that put the noble people or whatever in positions that they might not feel represented, since you're experimenting with representation. So in a sense, this put them on some thin ground, because they were free in a sense to experiment, but they also had to attend to the wishes of their patrons. So they were free to work as they wished, but they were not free to work at anything. But before getting to that point, I just wanted to mention, I mean, this is simply a hypothesis, but it's funny, if you get Aristotle's scheme of the four causalities, like material causality, formal causality, final causes, and efficient causes, you can see that each strategy negates one specific type of cause in the crafts labor. Virtuosity negates the efficient cause. And it negates what? What does it negate? Why does it negate the efficient cause? Because a silent producer is replaced by a singular artist. So you are negating at the level of efficient cause. Smoothness negates material causes. There are no traces of anything. There are no traces of objects, which are doing is producing an image. So it negates material production through technical means. And then in the end, there's the non finito, which negates final causes. And I think, in a sense, this is at the heart of his critique, of what he's trying to aim at. Because what you are negating is the idea that the project has to have a plan, has to have an idea, has to have a telos. And when you do a project, an object that is unfinished, you are negating the need of an object to be directed at the market. So, of course, one negation remains. I mean, one negation is preserved. One cause is preserved, which is formality. I mean, and in a sense, I think it's preserved because what is most important for these artists? It is that art becomes, that plastic arts, which is a manual labor, becomes an liberal arts, which are intellectual labors. So I think it's not by chance that formality is preserved. So preliminary results before moving on to how I think this relates to STP. The movement is contradictory. There's a contradiction. And of course, this is a productive contradiction, because in order to go towards ideas, you have to do this through manual labor. You cannot simply wish your way out of manual labor, especially if you are a painter. I mean, for other people, you can do that, but you're probably not going to be an artist in that case. I mean, not a plastic artist. So the work is free in a sense, because it negates. What does it negate? In what sense is it free? First, it is free in a negative sense. It negates the subordination present in craft labor. It's a negative. It's a negative. A determinate negation. I mean, I get confused with all these Hegelian categories. I'm sorry. And Miriam is not here to help me today. But even if the freedom is relative, because they still have to attend to the wishes of their patrons, they are free to choose forms of representation. So they can work as they like. That is the freedom. But there is also a positive form of freedom, because these experimentations away from craft labor, they draw up a negative space where freedom is exercised. And what sense is freedom? In what sense does freedom exist in plastic arts? Well, it is the abolishment of a rigid separation between planning and making, because it's not a product that is going to be built. And this is important because this is exactly the opposite direction that architecture is going. Architecture did not have a rigid plan. And he talks about this. This is very interesting. He says that when people built like cathedrals and stuff in medieval times, late medieval times, like you would have drawings, of course, but you would draw them on the floor, you would draw them on the wall, and then you would erase them. You would do them for practical purposes. I mean, I haven't worked this out, but I think in some sense there are analogies we can do with what we are doing here and our issues at trying to structure a structure which is also not so rigid, but which remains flexible. But let's leave that for the future. So in a sense, there's a separation between planning and making, which is abolished. And this is further worked out in his book on Manet, because the guiding thread of Manet, of the book, is because this book, the first volume, is plastic arts is free labor. So it's a form of negating labor, subordinated labor, through determinate negations. Well, in the modern experience, this phrase will invert itself. It will be free work is art, in the sense that it does not matter what you're representing. Free work is just doing, of course, planning, but it's represented in the form that Manet paints. Manet did not think what he was going to paint. He did not want to make the same paintings. He wanted to, he knew that when he started painting, what he finished would be different. And apparently, and this is Ferro's, he has like a 50-page analysis of this painting. And actually there's a video, because he does a little maquette, a little, I don't know how to say maquette, but he does like, I mean, it's like, he does these things. He builds the painting in 3D so that he can show the history of the painting and how it is free even from itself. But we can leave that for another moment. I can give you the link to this video. He says it in French, and there's subtitles for Portuguese. It's like, it's incredible. I mean, the man is obsessed. You cannot not love someone like that. But okay, just so we can get this to a closing point. How does this relate to the STP research program? Well, I think it relates in two senses. First, he gives us tools, and tools that are like examples. So I think it inscribes itself in our wish to work out with more case studies, in a sense. I think I'm taking this as a case study in a way. He gives us tools for further development of the problem of cognitive mapping through political experiments. Because what is mapped out here is not simply social relations, but it is a social experiment, the reorganization of labor, that makes the world appear different from it is. We don't simply get an image of the world, we get an image of the world, what the world is and what it wants to be, what it can't be. There are contrasts that appear. And there's also an attempt to understand, I think, how the present world is more limited than its possibilities. I don't know if we have a name for this, but I call this, I think this is the org hypothesis, which is basically the idea that from what we worked out in the Atlas, that org is larger than K, or the possibilities of social relations and social forms of organization. They are larger than what is currently available to us in our world. In the first manner, this appears because the works of art, they are not simply mediations of social structure. I mean, this is like, he is not Jameson. The works do not give us a privileged point of view of what social reality is. And what I think this avoids is something that happens in Jameson's cognitive mapping, is since the works are mappings of social structures, they are all always mappings for an individual. This is, I mean, I think we've discussed this maybe not extensively, or maybe not all of us at the same time, but I think the idea is that, okay, the world is presented, but what can I do with this? This doesn't get me closer to communism. What he does is see that the aesthetic solutions in the works of art, they are traces of experiments of social reorganization. So it's a bit different. The social mediation is not the work of art, but it is the specific operation that produces the work of art. And in a sense, I mean, I think I'd probably love to hear Caron talk about the noise scene, because I think we've talked about this. I think your text on, your essay on, how do you say tosco? I don't know how to say the rough cat.
Yeah, that's kind of, that's a problem. Like bigode manhoso is the same problem. Like we can't really, translate bigode manhoso. My Polish friend wanted desperately to know what bigode manhoso was. I was, come on, I can't translate bigode manhoso. But then we translated it for clumsy cat. It's not really gato tosco, but clumsy cat. Yeah.
Actually, yeah, okay. But I think there are some issues that really remind me of how noise scene works, in a sense that it's not simply it's not, the works are not simply mapping out social structures, but the manner in which these conditions of productions are sought out and people try to organize, and there's a relation with I think there's a connection. I wouldn't be able to do that connection, but I think at least it reminds me a lot of your essay. So what we get in these solutions are the attempts to escape capitalist struggle, and the works of art themselves are forms of negating the labor that characterizes the social condition. So in a sense, what we get here is a mapping of social conditions, yes, because we are trying to escape them. So it's like, in order for us to free ourselves from work, we have to have a rigid concept of what this work is. And they do it not through a description, but through a negating of this work. It's as if the work that constitutes our world, our social world, it appears through its negation. So in a sense, what is mapped is not social totality, but it is the difference, the contrast between a desired world and the current world order, which is in a sense org larger than K. I think this is what is happening over here. But there's also another sense in which I think, and I'm almost finishing, in which he shines some light into our collective research project. Because many of us are very much inspired in the seminal essay by Roberto Schwartz, which is Misplaced Ideas. And this essay is available in English, so I would very much recommend it for the English speakers, because it's one of the high points of Brazilian critical theory. And basically, it's a preparatory essay for Schwartz's book on Machado de Assis. And he has a question in which is, when we see European ideas in Brazil in the 19th century, like ideas about freedom, equality, social justice, all these ideas that are emanating from the French Revolution, from Enlightenment, they get over here. Every aristocrat's son studied in Coimbra in Portugal, so these ideas circulated wildly in Brazil. But what does it mean for a slave owner in Brazil to espouse ideas of freedom, justice, and equality? And this is not only a problem from a leftist point of view. This is a problem that existed in the 19th century. There were discussions, like people were complaining that the ideas imported from Europe did not make sense in Brazil. So he asked, what does it mean? What does it mean that these liberal ideas arrive in the periphery? Well, what happens is that the truth of these ideas is, in a sense, revealed through the misplacement, through the transition from the core to the periphery. So tragic ideas, and they are tragic, I think, from the point of the view of bourgeois or the leftists in Europe. I mean, fuck, we cannot get social justice. We are going in that direction, but we failed. Like I think the Hegelian viewpoint that you are always trying to go towards the ideas. The ideas are the gravitational pull that moves history. When these ideas are transported to Brazil, they become a bit of a comedy, because there are two contradictions that appear in this moment. First, these ideas are mobilized by elites that seek to modernize the country through slave labor. So let's get social justice, let's get to social justice through slavery. That's what's happening. So there's a contradiction that is revealed, that these ideas can be mobilized regardless of who is using them. But there's also a different thing that reveals itself, because while in Europe these ideas relate to real social tendencies, in Brazil they express a division of labor where there are structures of dependency between peripheries and core. So the fact that these ideas are circulating make it clear that, in a sense, what we are doing here in Brazil is letting the core develop its social justice. So there's the ideas are, in a sense, hollowed out, because what is this freedom for? But what does Ferro do with this? How do I think this relates to what he does? And how do I think this relates to our project? Well, he does a sort of double twist to take Lévi-Strauss' idea that myths always operate on a double transformation. First, it's not misplaced ideas, it's misplaced labor. Why? Because Ferro, he's talking about not about ideas, he's talking about a work that wants to be spiritual, that wants not to be manual, that wants to be intellectual. There's an unworthy practice that reorganizes itself in a way that it is attached to another circuit, to the circuit of liberal arts. I mean, art does become, plastic art does become a liberal art. But a contradiction appears in this transition from manual labor to intellectual labor. First, that it is a manual labor, and so and to be an intellectual labor, you have to hide the manual aspects. And also, you hide the manual aspects through more manual labor. So in a sense, I think there's a first difference, which is from misplaced ideas to misplaced practice. It reveals a contradiction between this relationship between intellectual and manual labor. But there's a second twist that I think is more interesting, is that it's an inside-out transformation. The misplaced ideas, they go from France to Rio de Janeiro. They travel globally. They go they are outside in, they are external. And what happens when they travel is that these ideas, they reveal themselves as hollow, because when it gets here in Brazil, it's ridiculous to talk about freedom when the social structure of Brazil is constructed on slave labor. It's ridiculous. So these ideas reveal themselves to be hollow, ridiculous. It's funny. There's a way, I think there's a way we have in Brazil to say this, like, só acho engraçado que. Like, these ideas, when they circulate in Brazil, they're like, oh, this is very interesting what you're saying. I only think it's funny that you are defending freedom from the point of view, and you are like, you have thousands of slaves. That's very nice. And it's different from Europe, because in Europe, there's a social tendency towards actual freedom in a different sense than in Brazil, because Europe's freedom is based in the exploitation of slaves in Brazil and also in the United States. But what happens in the artistic practice? It is not an outside idea that travels, it is an internal transformation. It is a determinate negation of a certain mode of production, of a certain manner of organizing labor. So what it shows is that practices are more complex, denser than we thought them to be. And when they do that, they do not point to the world being smaller because we are not communist enough. They give us an actual glimpse of the fact that maybe free labor might be possible. Of course, it doesn't express this in a way that is universalizable. That is one of the problems. And that is why Sérgio Ferro is, above all, an architect and more than a painter. And his paintings are really weird. They're not really good paintings. I don't think so. I mean, there's an idea, but I think, there's too much of an idea. That's the problem. But in a sense, we have a double twist, because not only in one side we have hollow ideas, the other we have dense practices. And in the other we have hollow ideas that reveal that the world is small, sad, tragic. But these practices reveal that maybe the world can be something else. We have an example. That is what the artistic practice is. It's a glimpse of another social order from inside capitalist order. It's a map, in a sense. Not a map that can be used without transformations, but there's a possible route. Well, this is what I had planned for today. This is, like I said, it's still a work in progress. I'm currently working on the second volume, which attempts to show how instead of you get rid of the concept and art becomes, in a sense, I mean, the idea I think is that everything that is work, which is like truly experimental, it will in a sense be free. So he inverts, it's not arts is free work, it's free work is art. I think so. Yes. So anything that is free work will be in itself an art, in the sense that it is a free experimentation. But so maybe I'll come back with that, and then later on I will come back with the counterpoint of architectural history. Okay.
Can I ask questions? Yeah. Okay, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, I have a bunch of questions. I think three kind of thematic nuclei. One is free work is art, as you say, right? I think it's kind of interesting to think possibly because I don't, as you know, I didn't read the second volume yet, so I'm not familiar where he's going after the 19th century and all that. And it's a shame that we don't have the third volume, because I was struck by the fact that he thinks Manet is without ideas, not in the bad sense, but in the sense that he's not a conceptually oriented kind of art, right? Whereas in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, he would have to go back to this idea of the concept, of the function of the concept, right? Because it was mainly the thesis of the dematerialization of art and all that. So it probably would have something that he would have to deal again. And I would be curious to know how he would translate that, that absence of the ideal in Manet and Picasso, and then to go back to the conceptual thing that was present in the non finito in the conceptual art, right? But I have actually a question about this. That is the following one. Interestingly, I think Sérgio Ferro goes a long way into locating an emancipatory impulse in the artistic practice, right? Like there is a kind of, even as you said, that there's kind of two possible readings of their motivations, one of which is more emancipatory, another one is more self-interested. But anyway, it seems that there is an objective tendency towards a kind of emancipation from non-free work, let us call that. That's interesting, and that's located in art. So it's kind of interesting to cross this diagnosis with the one by Peter Bürger, for instance, that reads the avant-garde as a critique of the art institution in the name of that freedom, because the art institution actually is a kind of it's closing off the space of freedom in the institution so that it is not spread through evenly in social life. So this is basically Bürger's reading of the avant-garde impulse. Okay, so I was always very interested in that position. But then it's interesting because for Bürger, it seems that you have to have anti-art, which is a kind of negation, in order to negate the institutionalization of art, which is actually a kind of negation of the freedom that would be built in the art's impulse towards emancipation if we follow Sérgio Ferro, right? You get the picture, right? So, and then you have somebody, then in the late 20th century, you have somebody like Henry Flint. Henry Flint is an artist, for those who are not familiar, an artist and a philosopher and a musician, somebody that is very close to me in the sense that I work a lot about, I wrote a lot about him and all of that. And he had this concept of constitutive dissociation, which is actually for him a way to come up with different forms of practice that are not art. So a constitutively dissociated situations, like his main example is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And he defines it as you have a certain kind of practice. The practice is organized by certain protocols. For instance, going to a concert, you have the audience, and you have somebody playing music, and the audience is listening to the music. And then the instigator of the practice changes the aims of the situation without declaring. So you have this contrived enigma, as he said, like you don't know what you're doing anymore because it's not really art, it's not really music anymore, you don't know what it is. And then I'm getting at somewhere, sorry, it's kind of a little bit long. So the thing is that Flint wanted to propose constitutive dissociations as a way to come up with different kinds of practice. In a certain sense, a kind of a free kind of practice, a practice that is not goal-oriented, not oriented towards a certain aim, specific aims, right? Then the problem is, this gives us a different interpretation with the idea that free work is art. Whereas free work is art seems like an emancipation in a certain sense, right? Now it's not like that. Like if you come up with a situation, for instance, with a constitutive dissociation, and come up with a situation that is not, conceptualized in a certain way and with a defined protocol, it will get caught and conceptualized as art. So the interesting thing is that it's difficult to negate art itself as a kind of enclosure space that is enclosing free work. Because when you propose something like free work and you try it not to be art, it will be seen as art. So it's not that art is free work, which is the first proposition in the beginning of Sérgio Ferro's idea. But we can think maybe completing his thinking. I'm not sure if he'll get to that, but there is kind of a shift in the middle because I'm using Peter Bürger and Henry Flint to complete it. But free work is art then, which is the inversion, is not an emancipatory move. It's actually an enclosure. Every free work you come up with will be seen as art. You will call it art, because you don't have any other category where you can have a kind of work that the product of which is kind of disinterested. You're doing it for the aesthetics or the experience or whatever, right? And I think, of course, the market has something to do with that. You know, the way this gets caught up in a certain kind of market for these kind of experiences that, you know, supposedly exemplify free work, but then they are just art in a kind of a bad sense. I'm talking about talking as an artist that also tries to flee art sometimes. So this was the first thing that I thought of. The second one is much briefer. I think it's interesting your last conclusions about not art as portraying art as cognitive mapping, the cognitive mapping thing, right? It's not the work of art that is doing the mapping, but the organization of the labor that went into the work that, in a certain sense, is doing some kind of mapping, if I understand you correctly, right? There's an interesting kind of connection there to certain positions in the ontology of artworks, right? Because usually in the ontology of artworks, we only think of the artwork, the object as the artwork, right? So the artwork is, in a certain sense, can be an abstract pattern instantiated into an object, things like that. This is all in analytic aesthetics, right? But there's one interesting position that reminds me of what you are saying that can lend itself to this reading is the art as performance by David Davis. David Davis is somebody that says that all artworks are performances, not only, performative arts. So for David Davis, painting is a performance, which is kind of counterintuitive, but goes, I think you would agree, if I understand you correctly, you would agree with that, because what is the activity of the painter? The activity of the painter is defining a focus of appreciation, which is the painting. But what you are appreciating is not the object, but the process that went into the object, the labor, the techniques, and all of that. So at least from the point of view of somebody who loves painting, this is usually what's important, right? So how was it done and what is trying to do, much more than, is it beautiful or not, as a surface. So this generalization of art into performance is quite interesting. But then you have for visual arts, you would have to do it as a definition in a certain sense, like as a kind of an ontology, a specific ontology. Whereas the problem of the organization of art as being a certain way of mapping is much more overt and much more evident, for instance, in the performing arts itself. You mentioned the noise scene, but not only the noise scene, any performance art that tries to portray the conditions of the performance inside the performance itself. And in my reading, this is what Cage was doing in 4 minutes and 33 seconds. He wanted us to, listen to sounds as being just sounds with no intention. This was his ideological, justification. But what I think he ends up doing is to showing the ritual of a concert as a contrived ritual, as something that is, in a certain sense, artificial and socially instituted. So this is kind of a normative turn of Cajun practice that makes it part of the work, the way the work is presented, which would be maybe the Brechtian also gesture in theater. But then you have an interesting thing about an interesting area of exploring this idea that it's not only the finished product, but the labor that went into the artwork and the motivations that went into this labor that are, enmeshed in this whole social scene that justifies it as a kind of the production of a certain result. And then you have the result is not really what matters. It's all the whole process and the way that it's picturing certain, social tendencies, which is interesting. And I was discussing this with my spouse today about, for instance, what punk rock did for music in a certain sense. People think that punk rock is, 3 chords and somebody screaming. But what happened in punk rock was that you had this kind of this integration of incompetence. You can be incompetent, which is a kind of negation also in the sense of Sérgio Ferro. You can do music that is incompetent. You can play an instrument without knowing how to play an instrument. So this was the first thing. And this incompetence was a kind of a democratization in a certain sense. So everybody could make a band tomorrow and start playing the 3 chords, right? And also it led to a reorganization of the labels, of the different labels and the way, the way the music was distributed. So what's interesting is there is a kind of interesting passage between a certain kind of aesthetic content sometimes, what it takes to come up with such an aesthetic content, and the way the social milieu has to be organized in order for that to come about. So if you break the hierarchy between artist and audience, for instance, how it was done in punk rock, you are opening a certain space of organization for those who are not necessarily professional musicians, right? So this was the movement of Clumsy-Cat, of the text that you were mentioning in a certain sense. I was trying to, connect the reading, this reading of, the Cajun gesture, of institutional critique of certain sorts, with actually a kind of constructive view of organization that is embedded in certain forms of what we would call a kind of critique. For instance, the critique that punk rock makes of, musical literacy. But this critique actually has consequences for the social organization of the music world. So I'm just externalizing some possible agreements and developments. And yeah, I think that would be, I have a third thing, but I talked way too much already. So if you want to comment on that, maybe I'll get back to the third thing.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's, well, we've discussed about this, and I think we will continue discussing this in the future. And I think you have some very interesting points. I won't be able to, I think, comment on everything, but I think I wholeheartedly agree with you that I think the point of the third phase of art, which is the third volume, which has to do with the financialization of capital, it is the impasse, the contradiction that artists have to deal with is exactly with that. Free work is commodified, and I think it's and I think we can. I think this is what I find really interesting about Ferro, and this is what I want to study in the next months, is that he's very careful to construct this narrative with an eye that makes the connection between the state of labor forms of organization and the technical developments in art. So, for example, this is something that he only says in volume 2 about volume 1. When we have the labor, the crafts labor, there's the formal subsumption of labor by capital. So I'm not a Marxologist, so I will say this very plainly and vulgarly, but labor is, you use it to generate surplus value, but this labor has its own logic and its own knowledge that is essential to the development of production. So, for example, because architecture was, according to Ferro, until the end of the 19th century, a manufacture mode of production, and it's currently pseudo-industrialized right now. But what does this mean? It means that the woodworker, he has to have the knowledge of how to do the wood, and you will not interfere in that. What you will interfere in that is that you will subordinate his work to a grander scheme. And this is what appears in the Renaissance arts. You have a form, there's a formal structure, there's only a formal subsumption in the sense that there is this knowledge that the artists detain that in a sense makes them free to develop labor as they wish, but in another sense, they are still selling their products to patrons. So they have, they in a sense, they mirror the different areas of labor, in the sense that there is still a certain knowledge that is important in production, and that the worker may be alienated from the total product, but he is not completely alienated. He is not turned into a machine. And what is happening in the 19th century? There are two developments that are happening that are very important. First, free work, arts, plastic arts became institutionalized. So what it's the same story that repeats itself. What was revolutionary in Michelangelo's time was institutionalized by an academy that chose who would be worthy or not, who would be valuable or not. So in a sense, it was turned into a conservative practice. To paint like Da Vinci in the 19th century was conservative. And why did this start to fall? First, because you have the beginning of a new social order, where, and this is something that I still have to organize these ideas, but Ferro will say that you have a social relation that is not hidden by symbols anymore. The social relations are ordered through objective agreements of the exchange of labor and commodity, labor and money, and so on. So in a sense, what you have is you don't need symbols anymore. You don't need to represent and to create symbolically, because what is the means of oppression are now hidden inside the abodes of productions, as we all know. So in a sense, the need for a representation, which is what made the Renaissance artists have a chance of free work, it's not so much anymore something that bourgeois want. And in a sense, the bourgeois are linked. I think Robert Pippin has a very good essay on this. But the bourgeois are linked as the ones who are culturalists. They're culturalists because they don't need to have culture to exert power, in a sense. So this is one sense in which the academy will start to fall, the social institution of art. But in another sense, we also have the real subsumption of labor. And the real subsumption of labor is that people will stop having a knowledge of the work. They will have less freedom. And in a sense, they will be even more alienated from the production, and they will be even more subordinated. And what is the mirroring of that in plastic arts? It is the fact that now you have also an atomized painter. You do not have anymore a corporation like Michelangelo's corporation. You have Manet painting in his home, and you also don't have the social knowledge that is transmitted. You have techniques, but you unlearn them, you do other stuff with them, you don't respect them because they don't make sense anymore, in a sense. So it is in that specific context that free work becomes art. But and I think this is very good what you said, and I think it takes us to Cage. The problem is that we are in another stage of capitalism, which has also made real, which has made real subsumption take another turn, in a sense, which has to do with financial capitalism. And I do think what you're saying is very important because, in a sense, being free has turned itself into a commodity. So what is art in this point? And for people who check the first volume, this is very interesting. He will say, there are three stages, like really Hegelian, vulgar Hegelianism. Like there's the virtuosity, the smoothness, and then the non finito. And then there's also these three stages in the modern art. And then in the current art, he will say there are stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 is like question mark. So we do not, I think he's trying to point, we do not have a solution to this yet, practical solution. But in a sense, I think it's very clear. I'm very interested in I think now, I think in the coming months, I will talk to you about, I'll get bibliography on Henry Flint and stuff, because I think in a sense, free work is not free labor is not enough. That has been commodified already. And I think in a sense, I mean, not to be too crítica social foda, like woke social criticism. If you take an influencer, a lifestyle influencer, that is commodified free labor in a sense. So I think, and that is a commodification of performance art in a sense. I think there's a link between that. I don't know if it's done already, but I think it's an effect in the same way that the autonomous political cries were transformed into management techniques. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And in a sense, which motivates me a lot, is I think that it ties together a lot of the problems that we've been trying to discuss in STP. I'm not one of the formalist people in the group. You all know that, but I think Renzo's concept of boundary that he developed, I think there's an interesting way to see how this dialectics unfolds through his formalization. But I think that's something that I want to do in the future. It's not yet developed, but I think I really loved what you said, Carol. My head is spinning.
Yeah, sorry, I said it in a disorganized way because
no, but we will get back to it inevitably.
This was a fascinating presentation overall. I feel like in the past session when you were mentioning that you were presenting this, you were selling yourself very short. It was something like, I just want to raise interest in Sérgio Ferro. I think it took like 5 minutes for me to be already extremely interested into reading that book. The rest was just like amazing, the way in which you like systematized what was happening, and also some of the implications in the end in particular. So thank you very much for the work you put in doing it, because it's really like it got to be an amazing introduction and also an amazing like thought-provoking thing in and of itself. I have a few questions, because I think there are a few threads in what you were talking about, which I would really like to pick up on, because they are things that I am a little bit interested in. So I think the first thing would be, because it's interesting that the distinction between what you're talking about, and like when you gave the example of the influencer, for example, as that person in which like his own free time is commodified through a certain like platform that enframes what's happening with him. And it reminded me a little bit about the board's theorization in that sense, because if you think about the board is all about the erosion of the distinction between leisure and work at that time. But of course, like that distinction between leisure and work, it has a certain standpoint. Like it has the standpoint of the city for the board, in which like he's talking about like that very that under the influence of psychogeography, for example, which is like also this very extremely spatialized way in which capitalism like sort of times space out, you could say. And I think I would like to know, how would you explore that, like how, that because at a few times it seems that you have free labor, you have leisure, and you have, let's say, commodified or successfully abstracted labor. And but it seems to me like there is this, like the passage from, let's say, one type of labor to abstract labor is sort of clear, but I think that this passage between free labor and leisure is a little bit muddied for me. I'm not sure if there is a validation of that, or if there if there is a validatory instance between one step and the other, or like how would that work for the system. And the second thing would be, it's something that I think I typed on the chat. I typed a lot of shit in the chat today, but like but this one in particular was was something, at least. I was talking about a text by Sohail Malik, which is the ontology of finance, and I found very interesting resonances with what you were talking about, because he is mainly trying to tackle the derivative market as both a form of shaping a market, which is very similar to the way in which fine arts market shapes its own commodities, on the one hand, and on the other also that the material practice that enables derivative market to even exist or to even be a financial technology that like people talk about are also like have a kinship to what's talking about. And like there is a whole that they allow to frame time, temporality, and presence in a way that makes a certain split between prices and values like affected over there. And for him, this means a reformulation of political economy through art, which is, I find like a very interesting prospect, even if the theory is a little bit crazy and he's drawing mostly on capitalist power, and there is like a Marxist critique. I think it's a fascinating thread to think that actually art can offer advanced form of what the political economy could be modeled after. And I think that Mackenzie Ward makes a very similar point in her work also, because she talks about the way in which art works as this sort of laboratory of new property forms. So she's talking about like the rise of immaterial art or the immaterialization of art vis-a-vis a particular onslaught of financialization, like after the 70s mostly, but also before that in terms of financial instruments. And she's also talking about the way in which like this immaterialization of property also retroactively influences art. So I would be curious to know, because I feel like there are two axes to follow over there. Like you can follow the perspective of the art practitioner, and this would mean like to talk about the regime of property that inspire art. No, actually, like to talk about the role of the practitioner, how he's inserted into the totality. So like how does he appear as someone like within a capitalist economy? So to sort of compare the point of view of the artist as an employee with the whole validation of employees within a capitalist economy. And the other one would be to talk about art as this laboratory of new forms of ownership. So in which you start to own things and property itself mutates. So like the shape of the rights in which property is granted sort of change from one way to the other. So I would be curious to pick your brain in these things, because I found that, like, once again, thank you for the presentation. It was really good.
Thank you. I think you've raised some great points. Actually, this is, I think when I get to the point of getting to the third stage, I will definitely add Malik and also Debois also, because I do think you were right on point. And I would say something that this is something that bugs me, because because it's a fad in Brazilian social theory discourse, this whole neoliberalism. Sorry, my clumsy cat just entered the picture. She's definitely very clumsy, but she's not tosca, just clumsy. But clumsy and tosco, there's a point where it's not enough, because, but just because when I thought she's clumsy, but she's not tosca.
You don't really have tosco in English.
It's a pity.
Rough cat. It seems like a fierce cat, like an angry
cat. Yeah. But I do think that this is, I'm very like probably 101 political economy student. I don't really know much. This has always been a lack of studying. But I've been trying to think, especially through Sérgio Ferro, and I think you've made some good points that made some things connect for me. That, I was saying, because I hate the fad of neoliberalism. Everything is neoliberalism. So I just wanted to take this trash out. But how do we do this? Because this is actually a problem. I do think that the point of social relations have changed in the last 50 years, but I don't think that neoliberalism describes what it has. It doesn't have many an explanatory power. And I think maybe through Ferro and through what you're saying, and also I've been thinking a lot about this, about when talking to Renzo about his presentation, and also we've been discussing a lot because of Karatani. I think the type of appropriation that is happening that is different is a appropriation on social reproduction. So we have 3 stages. One would be formal subsumption, real subsumption, and I think the 3rd stage would be, in a sense, the subsumption of reproductive practices. This would have to be worked out, but I think it maps out with the Bordian and situationist critique. I think it also helps explain a bit how performance art is so easily commodifiable from the 60s onward. And also, but I think these are like more hypotheses that we should explore. But I do think that the problem of social reproduction is central, especially when we think about the case of architecture, because one of the points that is this is just sad, capitalism always wins, is because there are these movements from the 80s, which are in a part inspired by Sérgio Ferro, which seek to rationalize the self-construction of houses by poor people. They're called mutirões. And basically, the architect's work is not to be someone who gives orders, but someone who, he isn't also just a technical operator, because that's very problematic. He is someone who works, and I was reading the book by Pedro Fiore Arantes on new architecture. He occupies a position which is sort of a non-oppositional antagonist, which is a concept by Paulo Freire. And what is at issue here is the architect is someone who has to position himself, because he is also a political subject in that situation. He cannot hide behind technicalities. But this movement of trying to gain some political ground on matters of self-reproduction, it increases, or better yet, it decreases the value of the labor, and in the end, it decreases the salaries. Because if the laborer builds his own houses and builds them rationally in a way that is collectively a collective rationality, fuck it, why do they have to pay salaries? So in a sense, I think there's this issue of social reproduction. That's at least, I mean, that's something that's appearing in the horizon in the past months. And I think a lot because of the discussions in the group. And I think that's where I think financialization maybe, I think where I'm trying to ground all these matters. And I think art is a promising place because in a sense, it is an experimentation in a sense. It is an experimentation that I think it's very expressive, not only in the sense of its objects, but also in the sense of the practice that it has to do. But and I also think that what you said is very interesting, because this is something that I've discussed with Gabriel. When you talk about art, this is like he said. He was very, I don't know if wary is the word, but he was desconfiado. He was suspicious a bit of Ferro, because I think what he was getting from what I was trying to say was that Ferro was another cognitive mapper. But the manner in which he said it to me was not, oh, he's like just mapping social structures. He said, you cannot talk about art in a political manner and simply not lose anything when you're describing it in a political manner. So if you want to describe art artistically, it will appear in a certain manner. If you describe it politically, it will have to lose some properties and gain others. So that's the sign that there's something at stake that is different. And I think what's interesting in art is that, in a sense, what Ferro does is, what he negates is something that's very important in art, which is singularity, expression, sensibility. These are all things that nobody enjoys a work of art without considering. I mean, this is especially, for me, it's especially important because one of the most important concepts, I think, in the history of art, at least from a literature point of view, which is where I'm closer, is the idea of imitation and expression and mimesis. Mimesis is not simply an imitation as a copy, it is a certain reflection. And this reflection has to do with not individuality in an atomized sense, but with a singularity. And this is all very important when you're analyzing works artistically. This is the cognitive mapping, I think, James's cognitive mapping. But when Ferro talks about it as a labor, it loses something, because Duré's singularity becomes simply he works more time. So you see less of art, but you see more of other stuff. And I think this is a good trade-off. It's a sign that there's something happened. And I think it's important to see how this trade-off works in contemporary aesthetics. So to see what I think this is a task. And I think you framed it really well as these 2 points of these 2 forms of seeing. I think it connects really well to what I've been trying to think. So I think there's I'm personally very happy, because I've been trying to find the stable enough project to do stuff for a couple of years now. And I think this works really well. So I'm very glad that it makes sense, that what you're saying also, that it resonates and it's making it more visible.
Yeah, no, it's great. Like, it's extremely interesting. I just wanted to say, like, if you want to do something on Malik, it was the first text actually that I read with CPC. So like I did all the reading groups over there, and like I would love to see it, like whatever that is, because I spent a lot of time in that small text, and it's a text that I really like and dislike in a lot of different ways. So I would love to see what you would come up with, like by having a look at it. And I think it's interesting, this economic aspect that you're talking about, because I remember having like this very vulgar talk with like, because this point of view of like the time spent in art is always very unsettling. And I remember, like, just anecdotally, like I had a talk, my boss is an art critic in a way, and a creator and so on. So like I was talking with him, and he saw the Francis Bacon exhibition in Tate. And then he was telling me, Francis Bacon was so smart, like that is extremely, like it's extremely easy to make from the point of view of labor, because the models are all he used photographic models mostly, right? So like it was a huge collection of those magazines, so he could work at any time that he wanted. The paintings, like it's mostly monochromatic, so like you can really, like if you deform the figure a couple of times and you can manipulate the figure outside, like it makes it extremely both like good, revolutionary, but it's also labor saving in a lot of ways. So like it has this catch of being like something that was needed at that particular time, but also like it doesn't require crazy like amounts of investment and labor. But like if you have a good pool of images, like a good database of that particular shape of body which you can move and you can like deform it in painting, then it just like
Actually,
it just
Francis Bacon did put those photographs in the floor so his visitors would step on them.
Yeah.
So the deformations were already naturally, so to speak, inflicted because people were walking over the photographs. So I just pick up, oh, this is a good model. So,
yeah.
Sorry. Just because I think this is spot on. This is
This is really interesting. That documentary about him that it's on YouTube. It's really good. It's I think it's called like A Brush with Violence or something like that. And it has all like you can see actually. What?
No, I think I've seen it a couple of years back. I don't remember it.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I want to see it, because I think what you're saying, and especially I like this anecdote of the people stepping. It's like the appropriation of social reproduction, in the sense that it's like just people walking. They don't even have to work for them to work in his favor.
The use of indeterminacy in art works like that mainly. I mean, John Cage, and what we call it's a kind of a surrogate, not surrogate reasoning, but a surrogate operation. You're not composing, you're making the dice compose, or making, chance compose, or making the, and there's some surplus value taken there, making the, performance compose for you. this kind of thing. So yeah, like this is a good way of putting it. I was curious about Moscardi's question. The way you read Malik, you said that Malik was in the ontology of finance. Do you think there is art is a model in the ontology of finance? I don't remember that bit of the paper.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that like for that. I think that it's more about the reception of the text, because that the reception, it comes from I think that the first sort of like yeah, I would say that this love at first sight that happened between art and derivative markets was actually with Eliash's book on, I think, the phenomenal swan or the blank swan or something like that. It was about the financial market. And then it became this sort of like crazy thing that everybody wanted to talk about. And so, oh my God, like the derivative is just like what we do. It's just like this crazy world on like speculative art. And of course, it only serves for extremely fine art and highly curated galleries. And like, it has to have this luxury.
Yeah, because that's the field that Malik also works in. Like he works in finance and he works about art. So, but I was wondering if you read somewhere there is the mediation made. I don't have it. I mean, I read, I think maybe all of his work that was published, and I don't really see, the mediation, a hard mediation between ontology and finance and, the art stuff. It's only, he's just saying that contemporary art lends itself to speculation, but it's pretty vague, the things about art when it comes to the economic aspect. You see, that it's more like an art criticism because, the cult of indeterminacy, he's one of the critics of the cult of indeterminacy. What some people are calling the cult of indeterminacy, that has to do with this commodification of, what Rafael Saldanha is saying about maybe commodification of social reproduction because of indeterminacy. So you don't really have to work, and you have nevertheless some kind of commodity, even without the labor that goes into it, because you're just, framing things in a certain sense. So yeah, and but what was interesting to me in the first question, this is why I asked the first question, is that it's not only that you can pick a free activity and frame it and sell it, but any kind of free activity that is kind of trying to portray itself as free will become something commodified in a certain sense. So there is a kind of reversal that is interesting to me, because, for instance, the thing I was talking about, constitutive dissociation is, there's some similarities, for instance, with the situationist kinds of strategies, right? Like to just present a situation and the situation is uncommodified. And Rafael Saldanha said something really interesting, like how was it so easy to have, performance art being commodified after the 60s? Yeah, but in the initial impulse was to criticize and to be negative towards commodification, because you don't have an object to sell. So how come this can be commodified, right? So this is kind of the contradiction within, post-performance art. Let us say it like that. Like you say, art that takes ready-made post-performance art, the art that is kind of framing everyday life in a certain sense. And sometimes you're not trying to do art. This is the difference with Flint. I like Flint a lot because he's a revolutionary. He's completely, authentic in that sense, but it ends up being sold and portrayed as art. So no matter what he tries to do. So yeah, this is kind of interesting.
There's this thing that I was thinking when you guys were talking, and I think in a sense, if we take, for example, how it is not just art that is easily commodifiable. I mean, just look at what are their names? Invisible Committee. Is there a political discourse more commodified than them? It's like it's an industry in a sense. I mean, especially in Brazil, but I think in the US, it also had some. It also made some strong impressions. And I think in a sense, the issue here, the point of struggle, as you pointed out, is it's not anymore between, oh, I'm going to negate work, It's like you have to negate a commodification. It's like everything you do, it's going to be commodified. So in a sense, it seems like a new stage because everything is so easily commodifiable. I mean, one of the lines of work that I'm interested in, but I've never had the time to develop, is the commodification of theory, in a sense. Not only in the sense, because I think fashion is something that's interesting. Fashion does have a role to play in capitalist society, in societies in general. It is a form of newness, but fashion from the point of view of these new social relations, everything becomes easily fashionable just because it's new, and then it's transformed into an object, and then the person has to, in a sense, negate this object. And we have these things that I think I think there are two exits, two forms at least, two strategies. One of them is Foucault, and one of them is Badiou. Badiou is like, fuck this shit. I am going to do systems because I am a classic philosopher and I am a communist, and this is what I'm going to do. It doesn't have anything to do with you. And he will do these works that, okay, he does have the fashionable books because he's not stupid. He's trying to vulgarize his own work. But this vulgarization, I think it tries to produce barriers. Deleuze, on the other hand, he tries to produce barriers through his jargon, but then the jargon becomes the fashion, in a sense. The same with Foucault. Foucault tries to not be himself. And then we have people, oh, so I'm not going to do philosophy, I'm only going to be historicist. No more theory. Fuck it, that's just another kind of position. At least Foucault was doing something. So I do think I think you guys are and talking, I think there might be something here in the sense that the struggle of trying to avoid commodification is where we might be able to see the situation. I don't know.
Yeah, I would link that to art, like of what you were talking about, because I feel like between this commodification of theory and the commodification of free labor, you were diagnosing an art. You will find the curator like as the figure that sort of does that job in terms of like how do I actually raise the determination of a single work. You make like a small curatorial text into that, and you put like, if the work doesn't have enough meaning, you can attach some meaning to it. Like if you find someone, you find an artist, like if the work doesn't have enough meaning, you can attach the like someone's identity as an additional meaning from it, or like someone's perspective as an additional meaning of it, or someone's life history, or someone's like, or other determinations that would be like that would be monetizable in that sense, that will make that work special. And I think that this determination is like this post work determination is a lot of the times very like, it sort of illustrates this commodification of politics itself, like of political positions as something, and this sort of like abiding to a certain political position or having a certain politically correct position. And like I don't want this to sound like a criticism of woke culture, but I don't think that like the existence of a criticism of woke culture is something to be entirely like wiped out in that sense. I think it shows us something interesting, just as the existence of a conspiratory theory shows us something interesting, even if the content is just void. Like there's nothing to actually use in the content, but like the form shows us something. And I would go that way. I think there is a deep relationship between what we're talking about and like this role of, okay, let's just have someone telling what this artwork is about, and let's just like determine the political balance of that and make that thing valuable because of that political balance, which I think it's a trait of performance, for example, like because performance, if you really want to like a lot of the times it has to be coded, like it has to be codified for you to actually understand what's happening. So I remember there is a particular, I don't know if you're familiar with that, because it's a sort of it's a sort of like, it was a controversy at the time, but like this girl Alisa Schwartz, she made this performance piece which was mainly she said, I think she was a student from Yale or something, and she said that like her final work of graduation would be that she would impregnate herself, I don't know how many times, and then abort the baby, like I don't know how many times, and then it was always indeterminate if she was actually pregnant or not, but she would perform what she called a sort of like a sort of like a homemade possible procedure that was that worked with abortives, that would like not be able, like not allow embryo to actually like fixate in her uterus. And and she made that performance piece, and that generated like a whole moral panic. And then she had to actually, and the main thing that the AO wanted her to do was actually to go to public and say that it was only a performance piece and it was not real. And then she was like, of course the piece exists in its performativity, but then like I don't want to claim that I did it or that I didn't. And then it became this sort of like, because she had this very, at the beginning she had this very determinate code of what she did, that every month she would do this and she would do that. And then after the moral panic, it became something like indeterminacy came back again, and that's why like it sort of generated this huge intervention. And she did more work in that sense. She did something with like email chains at the time, and like she did a lot of like other stuff. And I find this interesting to be like, because it's a sort of work that lives on the description that it has, but it goes beyond it, and then it comes back for description, and like it generates this like moral panic or something. And I find these like this sort of like borderlines in which the performer has to respond beyond just like, okay, I just saw this, let me see what that means now. So like there is this girl dragging herself across the room, let me understand it, and then just move on with my life. And but this was not on her control, right? If there wasn't a moral panic, if she just received her diploma, like nobody would give a shit about that performance. But because of the controversy, then it became like it sort of got some radicality over again, and which I find like very interesting arc.
That reminds me of a certain point where Ferro says in the volume 2, where the artists are the only group of workers where, like you said, the curator criticism circuit, where they are governed not by artists themselves, but by a profession that does not have any technical relation to the artistic practice. So in a sense, I think there are two ways to see this. And I think the example you gave is very good, because first, in the example you gave, it's like, oh, well, this is the collapsing of the critic curators. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, because this is a collapse. You are not, the codifying did not work. So this structure, it reveals itself. It doesn't matter if this work of art is good or not. It's like, just like it creates a short circuit. And in a sense, the other thing I was going to say is what you said. I wonder if the curator here, he does not occupy a position similar not only to the accountant. I would say that maybe we have to get one, the accountant, and two, the shareholder, on the board. I mean, maybe the critic is the accountant because he codifies, he says what the curator wants to hear, and the decision is in the hands of the shareholder. And in a sense, I think this encapsulates the form of commodification. I want to read this. This is the other book by Pedro Fiore Arantes, who is the son of Paulo Arantes, which is our Lord and Holy Savior. Pedro Fiore, he's the guy who brought Sérgio Ferro back he made Sérgio Ferro back to a fad as much as he can be called a fad. But he has this book, and actually this book, it was translated into English. He tries to develop the concept of renda da forma, which is the rent of form, where he tries to understand these architectural objects such as the Guggenheim of Bilbao, which is like a horrific structure, but which is also, in a sense, very important economically. So I think there are links, and I was thinking, because you said, Carol, is there any text, I think by Malik, which he does the mediation between art and finance. And I think in a sense, architecture is a concrete mediation of art and finance. So I think it might be a way of doing these links. I don't know. I'm very excited because I think there's a whole field with very concrete mediations that we can explore, where these things not and where we can do the transitions to different art practices, not simply like, oh, art is finance, finance is art. We can actually try and understand the specificity of manual labor and the specificity of, because for example, I think a lot about music. I mean, I don't think a lot about music because I'm not, I listen to music. I'm a bit traumatized with music culture, music forum culture, because I frequented a lot of incel forums when I was message boards when I was a teenager, and the music message boards were horrible. But there's this interesting thing, I think, because music, there is a way in which a musician is a craftsman. I mean, the guy who plays the background music, elevator music, people who do music for commercials, there is music as a labor. So I think there's a lot of, this mediation is a good place to understand, I think, the determinant negations of what kind of musician am I not being? Like, I don't think I've seen any commercials with noise music, for example. I mean, I don't know. Are there any? Have they been commodified?
Yeah, no, I don't know of anyone. No, no, I don't think so. And not even, experimental contemporary music for that matter. Yeah. There's this whole plethora of things in music that, got shut in the niche, It didn't get, I mean, the maximum of commodification. Of course, you have someone, of course. I mean, you can purchase an album by Stockhausen, of course. But, for instance, Stockhausen's appearance on the cover of, Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, this kind of thing, like this kind of, more popularization, more than commodification, you see, of this kind of music. It's quite difficult still. It's quite rare, I'd say. I'd say it's still rare. I think music has some, and I'd say that there's some sensible dimension that accounts for that, because it is really irritating. It influences on a physical level. So it's kind of more difficult to commodify something that, it's physically annoying than something that, sits nicely in your wall, in your living room, like a beautiful Kandinsky that you put in your wall, and you see, oh, that's so nice. So all that, grittiness and all of the, the transgression is lost in a certain sense. But music is physically annoying when it is transgressive. So I think this is kind of, there's a further limit to that, which is a kind of the doom of the experimental musician, because the experimental musician, on one side, he's doing something like it's like you are describing, like the type of movement towards a kind of emancipation from convention, emancipation from expectations, emancipation from, labor, for instance, functional music, doing music for commercials, this kind of thing. But at the same time, he gets lost and shut in this niche, and he's not able to make a living. So nobody knows that stuff even exists, or very, very few people know that stuff even exists. So it's kind of, there's a very, very big contradiction there. And my experience with that, and which led to the Clumsy Cat text and the album, which I did with Bruno Trochman, is that we're kind of trying to popularize this through the FOSFO and through this kind of through the dissemination of incompetence in art, in a certain sense. We can all be incompetent and do stuff in a stage, and what happened. So there's no professionalization, and so people felt invited to contribute and do something. So in a certain sense, the object, is the object the work, yes, still, or the art is the object, the circuit? Like what you're producing a kind of circuit in a certain sense between people, between producers, audience that become producers in a certain sense. So Yeah, this is something that interests me. This is why I kind of read a lot about punk rock, because I think it's one of the first times this happened in music, in the sense of late capitalism and the way you can disseminate agency, but within, of course, within the frame of commodification. So what you are able to do, you are able to, for instance, release your own albums, which is something that I do. So you're not, you don't need to go to a label, a major, and try to sign a contract and sell you the rights of your music to that company or stuff like that. So yeah, in a certain sense, it is the thing is that I find striking, and I think this leads us back to the discussion that you had with Gabriel, is that, of course, I agree with Gabriel. There are stuff like, for instance, I read sometimes Hans Eisler, who's a Marxist musician, who says, oh, the myth of the absolute music, of the pure music, was a bourgeois myth. And I can agree with him. At the same time, I listen to something like a symphony by Mahler, and I'm crying in emotion and stuff like that. And I'm not thinking about that as, the result of some ideological contrivance of bourgeoisie and stuff like that. I'm thinking that just as, how come this guy did this stuff? So of course, that something is lost when you're thinking of it from the point of view of labor. But what I find is interesting is, one, sometimes labor is in the picture. So you're doing a certain form of art that portrays itself as having the labor in the picture, and I think Sérgio Ferro is doing that when he talks about Dürer, and then the erasure of labor in Leonardo. I think there's something about that. So labor is kind of in the picture already, in a certain sense, and there are times that the things that the aesthetic content and the way it is done has social consequences, and the social consequences are built in what you're doing. So this is why I go back to punk rock. This is why I think punk is important. Punk is just one time, and this was happening. You had like this proletarian class kind of music, and there's this kind of trace of an event there that is anybody can have a band or anybody can play an instrument, something like that. And this had a very, very powerful set of consequences, not necessarily for the art world or for music, but for the social organization of the class of the people that were engaged in the music, in a certain sense. So this is kind of, and this is important. This is kind of a part of the, I think, part of the listening of punk. People listen to punk because of its political valence as well. So this is kind of important as well. I'm not sure it's disconnected. Of course, it depends on the example in a certain sense. If you look at a Mahler symphony from that point of view, maybe you lose more than if you look at a punk song from that point of view. This is what I'm getting at. So it seems that the punk song has already built in something about the world of labor that goes into making it and the way it organizes socially.
I think that's interesting, but maybe I think if you get punk, people will discuss which is the best punk, and so I think even if it has that built in as formally, and it's a formally in the sense that it's very close, I think, to where Sérgio Ferro is going with impressionist art. It's like it's okay to not be a craftsman because there are no fucking craftsmen anymore. So I think punk would be close to that point. We are in the point of real subsumption. This is how you do art when nobody knows how to, I don't know, do chord. More than power chords or whatever. I don't know anything about music. But you will still have, I think, people who will discuss, oh, I like this punk, I like that punk, and they will invent reasons, and then they will be like, oh, this lyric. And I think there's also the problem, not the problem, but what makes music a harder object is because there's this mix between lyrics and sound, and lyrics are a codification that people use to distinguish. So, and I think that's very hard to encompass, especially because I think if you were talking about, I'm trying to develop a Marxy vibe, which I don't know if it's very Marxist, but I think I understand why painting and architecture are prime examples, because in a sense they are concrete schemes that may be used for other arts, but which are more loose in the other arts. I mean, these limitations and constraints, they are looser maybe in other arts because they do not have the interrelation between architecture and plastic arts, especially considering their positions in capitalism. And this is something that, this is very interesting, which I think is very STP, which is why I want to call him over. I think he would be one of us. He has a book on Michelangelo, which is basically this. Michelangelo has a chapel that he did for thanks, Rafael. Michelangelo has a chapel he did for the Medici, and there was actually a chapel he did when he was, after he revolted against them. And in this chapel, we have a chapel, which is an architecture work of art, and we also have sculptures, which is a plastic arts. And Sérgio Ferro, he uses spurs and the concepts of firstness, secondness, thirdness, image, diagram, icon, whatever, to try and establish a common language that allows you to describe both objects from a single framework. So I think there's these, this is one of the things that I'm very interested in trying to understand, not only what he's talking about, but I think it's how he's talking about it, how he's constructing these mediations. They can be helpful. I mean, he does with Peirce what we're doing with category theory, logic of worlds, and all these different topology. I mean, I use topology for all these math stuff that I don't understand. But in a sense, I think he's in the same vibe as us. And I think music, it's interesting, but it also has different layers that, like when you get to the punk, that make it harder. It's harder an object to see because it's more mixed with other stuff. But I agree with you. I think there's very concrete determinations in noise that make it unquantifiable, and that you have to know noise as an. I mean, and if I'm getting what you're saying, the good thing about noise is that you don't have to be a musician to do it, but you do have to put your hand on it in a way to understand what's at stake. And I understand. I think. Did you do that thing where people did a piece of noise on the class? You were going to do that, right? Oh, a piece of music.
Yeah, I was going to do that, but yeah, it was kind of difficult because I thought I was going to get a rap because
Yes.
they are philosophers. They are philosophers. You have to grade them for the philosophical work. So I was trying to give a class where the music you do is your philosophy.
Yeah.
And that was a very specific way of doing it, and it had to do with the John Cage thing and stuff like that. Because I wanted to evaluate not what you're thinking necessarily, but what you are listening.
Yeah, that's good.
Because if I can evaluate what you are listening, and there is a specific way where I can make it explicit, you can justify why you are listening, what you are listening. So I was thinking, yeah, your music is kind of a thesis. It has a kind of built-in thesis in a certain sense. But yeah, this is very, very conceptual. But it was kind of difficult, so I just asked for a paper. But I did something very interesting that was almost like that, which was I recorded a version of 4 minutes and 33 in class. So just was silent for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I recorded it. And then I played back. So you are going to listen what I just recorded in the same class, in the same room. So I was playing back the recording. And I asked them, what did happen? What's the difference between the recorded result and what was happening? And they were, yeah, that's interesting because in the second time we were listening to what come out of the speakers. And I was, yeah, but you know what came out of the speakers is the same soundscape because we are here. I just recorded it and I just played it back. So it's the same. The dog that was barking there is the same dog that is barking here in the recorded version. And they said, yeah, but you know, you have a focal point. We're looking at, you know, the speakers. So the speaker is something different. It has a boundary in relationship to everything else. And I asked them another question. So is there something that came into the boundary that was not in the boundary when you listened the first time around? For instance, did you notice something that is in the recording that you didn't notice when you were immersed in the environment? And there was people, yeah, something. I didn't notice this and that because the recording device picked it up. And I told them, yeah, you know, you are picking up stuff all the time. So what I want you to do is get this recording, and you make a score for me. You will invent the rules of the score. This is okay, but you have to represent graphically what's going on in this recording. So you'll have to make choices if you want to do the traffic, if you want to do the candy man selling candy, or if you want to do the dog and stuff like that. If you want anything that you want, you may include, you can include, but you will see the scores will be different, and the scores were different. Some people were valorizing the traffic, some people were valorizing other aspects. So this was illustrating the selection that you operate within listening, and it is kind of linguistically mediated in a certain sense. So yeah, this was what I ended up doing instead of composing a new piece or something like that. But I want to continue working like that. I want to do kind of a projeto de extensão. I don't know how to say that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's more open, and that would be nice to have a experimental music, projeto de extensão of experimental music, and maybe then have people compose stuff, even people who never never did music.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of people like that in my classes. So this is quite interesting. And you have means to make and do stuff, like you have verbal scores and things like that. So it's quite interesting to explore these. But yeah, I quite like this idea of the filtering that goes into your phenomenology. So yeah, I was exploring that. So this was what I ended up doing.
Nice. Guys, I really enjoyed the discussion. I mean, it was excellent, and I think I will be returning with further steps on this path further along the year. Unfortunately, I also have to go, but it was incredible. And thank you very much for listening and talking. It was excellent. And if anybody wants to continue discussing, just hit me up.
Thank you. It was great.
Okay. Bye all. See you next time.